Okay, I'm back.
Okay, we uh, we have opened the doors. People are coming in. Welcome, everybody. You're in the right place, hopefully. And we'll get started at the top of the hour. Chris, do you want to share put your presentation in full screen mode?
All right, how's that?
That's perfect. Thank you. Okay, and
Got
I see it is the top of the hour. Welcome, everybody. My name's Alan Barr with COEH Northern California. And on behalf of the NIOSH-supported education and research centers throughout the country, we're pleased to bring you the first installment of the 2026 ERC Ergonomics webinar series. We offer free monthly webinars on various topics on human factors and ergonomics. This collaborative effort on behalf of each ERC's continuing education program aspires to provide access to current research supported through NIOSH ERC programs. Thank you for joining us today. If you log in via your registration email, you will receive a link to an evaluation form that will qualify you for a certificate of completion worth 1 continuing education contact hour. One upcoming webinar I will point out on February 25th. So what is that, next week? Retirement inequality and older workers. You can register for that and others at our website. For today's webinar, if you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the Q&A. We'll definitely save some time at the end of the presentation to address your questions. The webinar is being recorded. It'll be made available along with past webinars on the COEH Northern California YouTube channel. In support of our work, please take a moment to like and subscribe to that channel. A PDF of the presentation can be requested directly from COEHCE at berkeley.edu. That's COEHCE at berkeley.edu. Today's presentation, Boeing Exoskeleton Iterations, Succeed, Fail, Learn, Sustain. And I am delighted to introduce you to our guest speaker today, Dr. Christopher Reid is a senior technical fellow and Boeing designated expert for human factors and ergonomics and wearable technology. Based in Charleston, South Carolina, he's an executive fellow in Boeing's Human Factors Functional Chief Engineer's Office, supporting environment, health and safety, and production systems. He's an adjunct professor in practice at Clemson University Industrial Engineering Department. And prior to Boeing, he worked for Lockheed Martin as a human factors and ergonomics discipline lead at NASA Johnson Space Center as a human factors engineer for the U.S. Army Natick Labs. Externally, he is an industry advisor and volunteer for multiple technical organizations, such as the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, ASTM International, the National Academy's Board on Human Systems Integration, and the National Safety Council. He's a 2023 fellow and past president of HFES. He's a recipient of the 2018 Rising Star Award from the NSC, the 2020 Black Engineer of the Year Award for Outstanding Technical Contribution in Industry, and the 2023 HFES Arnold M. Small and Betty M. Sanders President's Distinguished Service Award. He received his PhD and MS in Industrial Engineering, Human Engineering and Ergonomics Focus, and BS in Electrical Engineering Technology from the University of Central Florida. With that, it's my pleasure to hand the floor over to our speaker, Dr. Christopher Reid.
Hey, Alan, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm just verifying. I'm seeing a bunch of things pop up in the chat. Sounds like folks are getting their audio right. Hey, thanks for having me here on behalf of the university. I'm happy to talk on this topic. I will say it's going to bring a bit of consternation possibly because not everything is perfect in the world of exoskeletons at Boeing, but let's jump right into it and we can discuss some more. Alan, just verifying screen is good.
Yes, sir. Looks great.
All right. Thank you, sir. All right, let's go right into it. Click through. Okay, so here we are on the topic of exoskeletons. Uh, Exoskeletons at the Boeing Company has been going on since 2012. We have been experimenting and dabbling in a variety of different types of industrial exoskeletons. I will say, in terms of exoskeletons, I'm not going to talk about medical exoskeletons or exoskeletons that might be used for leisure or exoskeletons that might be used for military settings. It's strictly looking at industrial exoskeletons in the context of what we played with here at Boeing. I'll go over a number of different things in this presentation, looking at human-centered design, particularly around human readiness levels and technology readiness levels, looking at how we go through qualifications and deployments of exoskeletons, as well as looking at how we collaborate with others externally from the company. Uh, for sake of making sure you have maximum real estate on the screen, what I'm going to do is go ahead and remove my video. I'll still be here on audio, but you guys can see my full presentation, and I'll come back online so that you can see me at the end of the presentation for Q&A. Okay, so let's get back into this. I just want to take a moment that the views expressed are my own and are in collaboration with Boeing, but they may not necessarily represent a company opinion. Okay, and for folks that don't know me, I tend to have a pretty colorful background in terms of the spaces that I played in. Many folks might know me from university settings. As Alan mentioned, I'm an adjunct professor at Clemson University, but I've also done many different talks like I'm doing here with Berkeley, and I've worked in a number of different places. I started with the Boeing Company a long time ago when I was doing my PhD and working as an engineering intern in ergonomics. You can see on this figure far left, this was actually me at the time underneath a winglet, a giant winglet at the Museum of Flight in Seattle. From there, I then finished my PhD at University of Central Florida, went on to work for Natick Labs in Natick, Massachusetts, for the U.S. Army as a human factors engineer. Then went over to Lockheed Martin. At Lockheed, I was a contractor for the bioastronautics contract, specifically at Johnson Space Center supporting astronautics work. And you can see there's a number of different things. I became a poking and prodding machine as a test subject once upon a time for an astronaut test subject in a variety of different ways. Later on, I came back to Boeing, worked on building a human factors and ergonomics lab here in Charleston, South Carolina. I've been here now for 10 years and currently a senior technical fellow, as noted, specifically within the human factors and ergonomics functional chief engineer's house, which is, if you think of it kind of like a university setting, there are many different functions representing different capabilities or different focuses, like looking at engineering and production engineering, or looking at structures or electrical engineering. Human factors engineering is one of the newest functions in the company. Speaking of, here we go, looking at human factors. A lot of this will blend some of my work here at the Boeing Company in the human factors domain, but also past work working with the Human Factors Ergonomics Society. The mission is no different. Essentially, we're looking at advancing the science and practice of human factors throughout the company and the landscape of products that we work on. Many people who come into our company come from different parts of life, different areas of expertise, from the biologies to the social sciences and the engineering side. But we all come together to rally around our products. And so when we look at where folks are coming from, I like to refer to this as the circle of life, looking at how people come in from academia, but at the same time, it's cyclical. It requires consulting, government, and industry to reciprocate and to harmonize with academia, both from a student, graduate, employee perspective, as well as a research and R&D perspective. A lot of opportunity to continue collaborating in these spaces. All right, so let's talk a little bit about HCD, human-centered design, and specifics to technology. I mentioned at the beginning that we're looking at human readiness levels. The human readiness levels is a concept that came out of the ANSI HFES, Human Factors Ergonomics Society combination. In 2021, it came out as a new consensus standard that actually is going through a revision as we speak. We're looking at a 2026 revision, which happens every 5 years. The intent here is for those who are unaware of the technology readiness levels or TRLs, technologies go through this type of readiness review to go from a R&D research and concept phase in the lower levels, like a TRL1, all the way up to a production and deployment level of maturity. Now, the HRLs are purposefully mapped up against those TRLs so that we can make sure the products are safe, ready to use, and effective for not only their end users, the people who may live in the passenger seats or the people who may be piloting the different products, but also for the folks who are part of the life cycle. Thinking of things from the not only the operationality or operability is the word I'm looking for, but also the maintainability when we look at our abilities, the producibility or the manufacturability of these products. So we have to make sure humans are considered as part of the life cycle approach in the design of the products that are built. And it's not just Boeing, it's products and technologies in general. When we look at our readiness levels and we frame them up next to each other, so we have our HRLs versus our TRLs, you want to make sure they're synchronized as they mature. So there is a level where a TRL, for example, might be moving along faster in maturity than its human readiness level counterpart, and vice versa. But the idea is to try and synchronize them through time. So let's see if I can get this cursor. Here we go. As we move from low maturity levels to higher maturity levels in the 9 category, 8, 9 category, they're right around each other. The concept here is if they come out of sync, you might have some disconnect, and one of the two will need to catch up with the other one in order to have a viable, useful product in the end. One way to do that, for those who are familiar with systems engineering, is looking at the modeling process. So model-based systems engineering is one technique that's used to help track TRLs and HRLs. It is something that we are continuously honing within our company on how we apply human readiness levels and making sure that we apply them into our product lines. I will walk you through a simple example. This is a low TRL, low HRL example. It's a helmet mounted display. In this case, we're looking at going from a very conceptual level at TRL1, basic principles observed and reported, matching it with the HRL1, looking at the capabilities, the limitations, the human performance. And then as you go from RL1s, I will say, to an RL2, a readiness level 2, making sure the two are paired. So now you're bringing into account the application that it's tied to from the TRL level. On the HRL level, you're looking at how the humans are tied into it, the human performance and design principles. You go into the 3 level, the HRL, TRL level 3. Now we're looking at where you're actually prototyping and bring in those demonstration concepts. So in this case, we're now attaching the helmet mounted display to an actual helmet, donning it on a person, seeing what's feasible, and then continuing to iterate from there. Okay, so at the aviation industry, it's no different, whether it's products for defense or products for commercial or products for air, space, or sea, it's all the same. You're looking at the humans in the loop, looking at the pilots, the mechanics, the ground service crews, the passengers, the factory workers who help build the products, and then the flight attendants. My major focus here in this presentation and my major role in the company is particularly to the production system and making sure we're making sound product with human factors considerations. And so that's where the focus of this presentation will be on the industrial exoskeletons in production. Before we go there, however, this is the last glance I'll put on the HRL scale. It's really coming back to these items that are listed here. It's How do we create a common language for addressing human readiness on all those different phases of the life cycle I mentioned? Making sure that staffing is considered during the different needs of the design phases, so that you can apply those requirements and execute on them. Then looking at how you get to the testing and verification phases, making sure the humans are considered in those phases, gauge the plan for the future development needs. So any kind of changes, evolutions that need to be taking place, even to the extent of looking at derivatives or any kind of evolutionary shifts from the original product. Managing those schedules and costs, you want to know those human needs up front, especially if you need to design for them. And then looking again at the cradle to grave framework, going from not only designing to build, but designing to maintain and potentially sunset that product and replace it with something new. So in the end, the human readiness levels, as it says down at the bottom, it increases the chances for program success, and applying that human element is critical in order to have, I think it's Professor Stephen Lavender from Ohio State who says it best. He always likes to say something that's useful, usable, and desirable. You want to make sure your product is hitting all three when you're getting it out the door. So with that, let's bring it home to Boeing and start making it relative from going from theory to application. Here's a quick video of some of our background on products that we make. Oh, Boeing, always making interesting commercials and interesting montage videos. So hopefully that was interesting for folks. I do always enjoy watching a great looking crab landing on that 777. I don't know if anybody's ever been in a crab landing. It is an uneasy feeling, to say the least, watching the side of the plane go forward. But as you can see, we make products by people for people. It is part of the justification for why we are here in human factors and why we're moving forward. When we look at the workplace, however, going into the production considerations, here's a quick example that's coming in from Liberty Mutual. They make a safety index every year. This one was last published, the last published update was 2025. And so here are the major incidents or hazards that are in the workplace across the United States that are causing trauma to our employees, our labor workforce. In particular, I've highlighted areas that exoskeletons can likely apply to and how we've been applying them within the Boeing company. So looking at areas of overexertion, exertions or bodily reactions, other exertions or bodily reactions, essentially called awkward postures. And then repetitive motions, involving microtasks, excuse me. When we add those variables up, we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of about 33% of the hazards, or 19.4 billion US dollars, as well as looking at the equivalent of about 53 million US dollars spent per day. And that is a lot of money. I'm not going to say we in the company spend anywhere near that level, but these three areas do represent significant concerns within the company, within the production system. In addition to those, here is a slide from the National Safety Council from back in 2023, looking at how musculoskeletal disorders, or MSDs, go across US companies. You can see there down in the bottom left, looking to heavy lifting at 13 billion, injuries from awkward postures, 4.7 billion, and then injuries from repetitive motions, 1.6. Just a different perspective in terms of data, but still consolidating around similar types of causes. The other things we have to look at within the exoskeleton space are looking at the injury history, looking at the capabilities or capacities of the different populations that do the work, the body parts that we're zooming into for consideration, anthropometry of those populations, because they have to literally wear the technologies, and then also their age considerations. In addition to those, you have to look at their injury histories and those examples. So are we looking at carpal tunnel, shoulder back injuries, muscle strain injuries? These are all part of the consideration factors when we're looking at exoskeletons. Then when we go into some of the other areas that if we go outside the box, outside the traditional hierarchy of controls where we have engineering designs or administrative controls, we start to look at some of the emerging technologies. This is again from National Safety Council. They had put out a publication back in 2023 where they showed a variety of different emerging technologies that were coming to fore within the production workspace or the labor workspace. Computer vision, wearable sensors, exoskeletons, cobots, and extended reality might be just some of the technologies that many of us have played with, and many of you might have played with. Again, it's going to vary by capability, organization, different types of cultures, all those things. But in effect, because we're talking about exoskeletons, I'm just going to zoom into that one for today. So, what is an exoskeleton? I'm sure many of you expected this. So if you did bet that there would be an Iron Man in this conversation, you won that bet. Yes, this is what most people perceive as an exoskeleton, although we all know it's likely not an exoskeleton. In this case, this is a movie prop. I just happened to be in a museum where it was at, and it was pretty cool. I wish sometimes this actually existed, but if it did, we'd probably be in bad positions in the world if we watched the movies, right? So regardless of that, let's go into defining really what an exoskeleton is. We'll talk about qualification, deployment, and sustainment. A lot of the decisions that we make in these spaces matter because it comes back to how the exoskeletons get used. ASTM International is one organization that I spend a lot of time with. They have a committee, F48, on exoskeletons and exosuits. Happen to be the chair on that one for the time being. They define wearable technologies and specifically exoskeletons as devices that augment, enable, assist, or enhance physical activity through mechanical interaction with the body. It's essentially something that can be powered. It can be powered in a variety of different ways. You can think of anything from pneumatics to hydraulics to electrical to just pure mechanical. Many of the exoskeletons that we've played with within the Boeing space have both of these types of capabilities, both passive and active, active being the ones that are, let's say, electrically powered. More specifically, we played with a lot of exoskeletons since 2012. I will just go ahead and call out the green boxes since most folks may be zooming into those. Those are the systems that we've actively qualified and deployed into the Boeing workspace. The rest of them, if you see the blacked out exoskeletons, those are ones we played with. I will say this is not exhaustive. There are many, many, many different manufacturers and makes and models that are out there, and the exoskeleton space is vast and ever changing. And so these are just a few of the toys that we played with, and it's been a fascinating and fun set of years going through evaluating these different exoskeletons and then figuring out what makes sense for our company at this point in time. Here's kind of that landscape in a over time setting. So again, pointing to the 2012 origin, we've crossed the 10-year line, and we are now in 2026. We've gone from just concept with do exoskeletons even work and are they a conceptual device that can work in the manufacturing setting to qualifying in 2019 our first exoskeleton, which was the ExoVest by Exobionics, going into the Levitate airframe in 2021. Then in 2023, the Evo Exobionics exoskeleton, which replaced our previous one with the ExoVest. And then the HeroWear Apex 2 has been the most recent. So moving from shoulder systems with overhead support to back systems for essentially stooping and lifting and lowering awkward posture type settings. The technology is continuously being evaluated, looking at different things that we might come back with and that might be feasible. But again, it is an ever-moving space, and I'll touch on evolutions and ecosystem shifting later on in this presentation. All right, looking at the qualification process, during that process, we work heavily with many different organizations, including the R&D organization of the company, now called BTI, or Boeing Technology Innovation. That organization hosts the R&D arm and really goes through the qualification phase. It works with a number of different other organizations, and then essentially makes sure that the system that we're looking at is something that's feasible and useful for the production space. We then go into a pathfinder where you look at a single site to basically do a shakedown cruise against, so that you can see if everything you're doing makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, making those corrections and updates. Now, when you reach a plausible phase where it makes sense to jump sites and programs, you can do so. Sometimes in our pathfinders, we work multiple sites at the same time, but essentially you're looking at now replicating and broadening that best practice across multiple sites. Your enterprise release essentially allows the system to be picked up anywhere across the company within those spaces that it's qualified for. And that's where you see more replication opportunity. And then the sustainment and end of life, again, looking at how do you sustain these different technologies so that it's not only something that is an experiment that you deploy, but then also something that you maintain over time, you replace over time, and then you even consider moving or removing from the system as the manufacturing environment is constantly evolving. ASTM put out a standard in 2020 called F3474. You can see it depicted here, one of the images on here. It's essentially looking at the different phases of evaluation that you go through during a qualification phase, and that we brought back here to Boeing. You have your technology demonstration, for example, going down the column, evaluation stage column. You look at your laboratory assessments, you look at your field trials, you look at your longitudinal and clinical trials. These are all different ways to evaluate the efficacy of the system and make sure as you go through time and through these different more complex stages that the system is ready for release. Under the tasks column and the metrics column, you'll see that there's different things that are assessed, from looking at individual joints and how those joints are loaded and how mobile they are, to looking at the tools and the materials and the different activities and tasks that they work with during the real world situations. And then also looking at how it comes back to not only the biomechanics, the ergonomics, but now looking at the mental side of the house, the cognitive side, looking at usability, user experience, as well as any kind of cognitive workloads or potential both mental and physical hazards to the individual. When we're looking at these different things, I just want to point out on the left here, within the company, we have a phased approach with how we expose employees to brand new products that we don't really know how they play on the body well yet. So as we go through a level of trust, through different stages of trust, and the system is meeting the demands that we're putting on it, we go from people with less injury history to more injury history. Because essentially you're going into those high hazard areas where there's likely people who have had past injuries in the past, and you want to make sure those folks will be safe to use these systems as well. So I did mention a multi-organizational approach. We go all in, we move as one Boeing, so to say. So a lot of organizations come to play when it comes to the qualification process. So I mentioned anthropometric assessments are part of that, documentation is part of that, field trials, looking at fall protection testing. It's necessary when we're in different areas that may require fall arrest. Looking at laboratory studies, working with partners in university settings to help us prove out some of the value statement behind some of these different technologies. When we reach the appropriate stage, we do in-house demonstrations and in-house assessments at the fire protection level, looking to make sure we have our emergency services ready to go to support these systems, looking at medical, EHS, environment, health, and safety, and then looking at legal to make sure from a litigation standpoint it makes sense also. After all of that is finished, we then move into an enterprise release. One thing that I mentioned before was tying it back to injuries. Here's an old data set from 2016 to 2019 just to show how we overlap different types of exoskeleton capabilities with different types of injuries that may be coming out. So from shoulders to backs to knees to hands and elbows, there's potentially an exoskeleton out there. Whether it makes sense, that's determinant on your qualification process. But here's how we've applied some of them and how we've thought about some of them. But it essentially comes back to those three major hazards: awkward postures, repetitive motions, and overexertions, and how exoskeletons can play into that. I did mention many organizations play a role in the implementation phase. So here is your Boeing Research and Technology, now called BTI, Boeing Technology Innovation. Then you have your production engineering, your using organization, essentially your end users, looking at your EHS folks, your accommodation folks, your supply chain, tool services, training representatives. Everybody plays a different role in the exoverse, the exo universe here at the company. So you're going from the R&D all the way out to the implementation, deployment, and sustainment phases. And that's just a high level overview of who plays what role in this architecture. Now, back in 2023, we were in a height of exoskeleton deployment specific to shoulder exoskeletons. You can see here approximately 400 units were deployed across the United States, across sites that were related to our commercial and defense organizations, as well as our global service organizations. We have a number of different sites in many locations doing many different types of things, from fabricating parts that might be going onto products or aircraft, as well as doing full-up assembly on some of those products. These were where we had 3 different shoulder exoskeleton devices deployed in many of these spots, from the exovest to the airframe to the Evo. All of them were out there playing in those spaces. So with that, let me jump into another video. I'm just going to scoot this to the side and come back. Let's talk about how some of those exoskeletons played into those spaces that I mentioned.
From Everett to Salt Lake to South Carolina, teammates across the enterprise are getting some extra help from a futuristic new piece of equipment.
My name is Jason, and I'm an aircraft mechanic at the Boeing company. I've been playing hockey since I was 4 years old. My parents got me into it. I'm like being safe inside and outside of work, and I suit up for hockey. I wear my helmet, I wear all my pads so that I don't get injured, and I do the same thing when I come to the Boeing company. I keep all my safety gear intact, I wear all my PPE, and this is part of my safety gear.
Boeing is committed to providing teammates a safe place to work and the tools to prevent them from getting hurt while doing their jobs. With a little out-of-the-box thinking, applying cutting-edge PPE technology, and an almost comic book flair, Boeing came up with a solution for teammates performing prolonged overhead work that will keep them safe and improve the quality of their work.
This form of PPE is a spring-based mechanism that you wear pretty much like a backpack. It has these actuators that go on the arms and actually hold the arms up. So depending on how much force you want, it could be anywhere from 5 to 18 pounds of offload. And it reduces the stress on the shoulders that ultimately reduces shoulder injuries in general.
And now that this exoskeleton technology has become standard across the business, teammates are finding great value in the many benefits it offers.
First time wearing it, I really noticed a big difference in my shoulder blades. By the end of the workday, I noticed that it was reducing the amount of fatigue that I had, for sure.
I use it for the overhead sanding, which, you know, anytime you raise your hands overhead, it's a little difficult for long periods of time, and it aids in that. It helps you brace yourself. It's like somebody behind me holding my arms up.
Since becoming a standard piece of equipment, injuries are down and quality is up.
I think we've dealt with some of the challenges that we have with building airplanes and the tough ergonomic positions that we put people in. And so these type of innovations and this type of investment for our employees, we're finding technology to solve some age-old problems we've had with building aircraft.
It was a little bit cumbersome at first, but after we started using it, it made life a lot better. It keeps you from getting fatigued, it keeps you from getting injured.
All right, so hopefully that video played. You guys were able to hear that. Let me jump back into this PowerPoint. All right, so you got an idea of some of those exoskeletons as they were deployed. In this case, that was back during COVID in 2021. Looking at exo specifically being deployed. External collaborations is the next pivot point that I'm going to make in this presentation, because none of what we've done was in a silo in terms of what Boeing has done. Obviously, we worked a lot with suppliers looking at the exoskeleton workspace, in the industrial exoskeleton workspace specifically. You can see on the right that onion, that layered onion, where you look at consumer right there in the core. I would say that's where the Boeing company is. It's a consumer, in this case, of exoskeletons. You have your producers, your investors and partners, academia, consensus standards providers, insurance providers, government regulators. All of these play into the space. They've all been partners in our relationship through the last 10 plus years with exoskeletons. I know a number of my different colleagues have not only partnered with us one-on-one, but also looking at ways that we can open up new parts of the ecosystem as allies with each other in each of those different spaces. So it's been a very much win-win type of collaboration, and I encourage all of you to consider that too. When you're looking at exoskeletons or any type of technology, don't go it alone. What's that old saying? It's an African proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go as a team or go with others. That's essentially how we look at it. We have a long distance run in front of us, and we expect exoskeletons to go with us on that run as well. On the left, however, pivoting over to some of the stuff I've seen in the publication space, some of this information is somewhat old, because this was the last time I did a major industry survey on exoskeletons going back to about 2023, 2024. In the publication space, many of the types of research that has been done to that point was really focused on controls, materials, power sources. It's really getting into the functionality of the systems. How do we make a feasible exoskeleton that not only is useful, but it is something that potentially can be desirable? And so a lot of the research has been focused there. That's likely to have started to shift, especially as the human factors community got more involved, has been doing more research and publications. That started to change to look more at the user experience side of the house, the mental and cognitive limitations and considerations, as well as the physical areas. When we look at the research focus, again, you're looking at exo viability and efficacy. Longitudinal effects is something that still remains out there. I know colleagues have still been looking at what happens to exoskeleton use over time, what happens to people that use exoskeletons over the long run, how do we maintain infrastructure, how do we maintain sustainment. These are all part of that same conversation. I know that conversation has been going many years, both internally and externally, and continues to persist. I don't think there's a silver bullet or an answer that can solve all those problems, because it has to be customized to each individual organization. Next one down is looking at defense and private sector anthropometric assessments. I mentioned earlier that the company goes through a qualification process that considers anthropometry, which is really important. When you're talking about a specific part of your population or user population, if you're looking at children, you need to make sure you're understanding the sizes and shapes of those children for those exoskeletons. If you're looking at grown adults, what ecosystem are they playing in? What global region are they playing in? Are they in manufacturing spaces in Asia? Are they in spaces in the United States or North America, South America, Europe? The anthropometry considerations might change depending on the population that you see the exoskeleton space being used in. And that's why that's important to understand who you're going to be making this system for. You want to make sure that that data is tied to the right population. You also want to consider, do you want to access maybe private data sources that might have more recent information versus public data sources? So those are considerations that still remain out there. When we get into the funding side of the house, it's been an ever-changing space. As we know, the US is constantly going through different changes when it comes to public funding, like NIH, NSF, NIOSH, and Department of Defense funding. It is continuously being limited. I know there's always consideration on not only are we looking at funding sources, but also looking at what the funding is covering, essentially looking at topics from emerging technologies like exoskeletons, robotics, automation, artificial intelligence. They're also competing against each other in terms of the actual bank accounts or funding sources that they're going after. So exoskeletons are continuously in a challenge for funding sources. I will say that the data that we're looking at in terms of the compound annual growth rate continues to change over time. I will say that that is continuously going up or down since COVID. This has changed substantially. The market itself has also changed. You can see an exoskeleton report that was put out in 2021, where we had 118 plus global companies. That is continuously changing. I know some companies have been bought out by others, and other companies have folded, unfortunately. So their products are no longer available. That affects how many of the consumers actually maintain and sustain those systems over time. It was one of those things that we looked at within our company from a supply chain perspective, looking at how effective will that long-term relationship be with that company if we were to start buying exoskeletons from that organization. It is something we continue to consider from a longitudinal sustainment perspective. The other things to think about, I mentioned working with other organizations. So down in the bottom right, you see different types of partners that we've worked with, from technical societies to government to consensus standards. They're all part of the different areas that we played in. Again, not going alone, but working with others to basically learn from the things that were good versus the things that were bad. Here's a more recent ecosystem evolution. I know, for example, I showed earlier, Sarcos technology was out there. Sarcos became Paladine. They shifted their focus from robotics, where we were talking about wearable robotics, to more machine learning and artificial intelligence. Bioservo recently was taken up by Skelex in terms of their Iron hand exoskeleton for their industrial exoskeleton. So again, it is an ever-shifting ecosystem that you have to be aware of. And then when we play with these different providers for these technologies, we have to make sure they have forms of resiliency that can work with us over time. So those are just two quick examples of what I'm referring to when playing in the exoskeleton space. All right, so where to now? You saw earlier a historical timeline. Here's another vantage point from that historical timeline. That pre-2016 timeline has been squeezed now to the last 10 years, 2016 to 2026. Back then, I remember in our lab doing those exoskeleton evaluations in-house. We built lab capability and people capability, and you can see on that image testing one of those exoskeletons on some force plates. We also looked at exoskeletons for the lower body at one point in time. Looking at, in this case, Noonie systems, where we're looking at seating capability, on-the-fly seating capability. And I'm sure many people who sat in lines and queues, particularly around voting time or concert time, wish they had themselves a Noonie. It's all one of those exoskeletons I wish I always had outside the company. Then when you look at what actually got qualified and released in that same timeline, you had the Exobonics Exovest, the Airframe, the Evo, and then finally coming in at the back exoskeleton side, looking at the Apex. It has been a continuous transition of how do you build a suite of exoskeletons over time and then sustain those systems so that we can actually use them as a set of tools for our mechanics to use in any of the different situations that may come into it. But beyond that, something to consider is what is known as a hype cycle, a popular one that's been used and many used for different types of technical or technology capabilities is the Gartner hype cycle. The hype cycle itself goes through different phases. When you think of the different capability or technology, you go from the technology trigger to the peak of inflated expectations, the trough of disillusionment. Many call that one sometimes the valley of death, where new technologies go to die. The slope of enlightenment, is coming out of that valley, and then a plateau of productivity, where you have the technology being used and sustained over time. Exoskeletons are no different. I would say, personalizing it to the Boeing company, we are coming out of that trough of disillusionment or the valley of death, going through the different considerations that are needed in order to sustain the technology more effectively over time. So climbing that slope is probably the phase that we're in right now. So to that point, there's a couple of things to consider as we refocused. I showed earlier in that timeline, refocusing our resources into a sustainment phase, going from evaluating many exoskeleton systems and qualifying all those systems to implementing those systems to now sustaining those systems over time. The need to establish the highlight that's written in there, the need to establish an enterprise program and work with the enterprise itself and work with the different programs added to the need for stabilizing that exoskeleton integration and sustainment. As you can probably tell, each of those different manufacturing spaces just within the United States alone have a unique culture, a unique environment, a unique product. And having to customize to that can stress the efficacy of the technologies that we're putting out there. So one thing to note there is the gap in ownership of the technology portfolio specific to exoskeletons is something that is a consideration for us. It is one of those things that we continue to work on to try to find the sustainment over time with. And more specifically, when we look at exoskeletons in terms of the 400 that were deployed that I showed earlier from 2023, those systems, if we look at where they are today, about 40% of them are actively being used from those 400 shoulder systems. Now, the reason behind that is many. Some of those could be from different types of employee turnovers, the end user who use the exoskeleton, the turnover and fluctuations in the environment, the subject matter experts that support the exoskeletons, as well as the executives and the managers behind them in the operation spaces. So dealing with people turnover is definitely one of those things that we're continuing to strive to fix and work through. How do we make a resilient, sustainable system that works its way around people through time? Some of the things that we've done to help with the sustainment, so creating personalized trainings, certifications for exoskeletons for their end users, looking at how those trainings get refreshed on an annual basis so that we make sure people remember how to use these different systems, looking at emergency services and how they come into the mix, just in case there's any kind of emergency in an exoskeleton, looking at the usability, making sure we adapted the exoskeleton to the individual and personalized it, so having fit cards and checklists, looking at the accountability, so making sure that we follow up with folks to make sure that the system over time has been used, and if they have questions, if they have needs, we're adapting to those different needs and taking them into account. Going into the adoption, as I mentioned earlier, every site, every program is unique. So tailoring it to those different needs in those different environments. Looking at the accessibility. So how do you get the exoskeletons to a place where they're easily accessible so that the people can put them on or take them off and store them without really going out of their way to do that. And so a lot of those came down to working with operations, working with managers to put them into those storage spaces, those lockers, where they're easily acceptable and accessible. The other thing to think about is the recycling program. When an exoskeleton reaches its end of life, what do we do with them? I like to joke around and say, hey, maybe there's a mausoleum out there just for exoskeletons, where exoskeletons are stored, maybe go into museums or university settings to be repurposed and have a second life. That might exist. If you know of one, please reach out to me. And we'd be interested in talking to you. Going into some of those additional roadblocks that still need some solution finding. I mentioned the turnover. That's a heavy thing when you're cycling through people a lot over time. Sometimes that can overwhelm your infrastructure and your system. And I know that certainly has with us, particularly when it comes to training and being able to keep up with the amount of training needed as people change. The other thing to think of is workplace culture. Some folks, depending on the exoskeleton, may feel a bit bulky and may feel like they could potentially harm the product or others around them. So they may not want to necessarily wear those exoskeletons. The other things to think about, some people may not want to take the time. So how do you make sure the exoskeletons are easily donnable and doffable, that you can take them on, take them off, and then come back and maybe change the settings or change out different parts when you're getting into the maintenance phases. Those are things to consider. The other thing that's out there is standardized support. So looking at people, the subject matter experts who would support these different exoskeletons in the different spaces, looking at the policies and processes and the command media, we call it, the things that you need in the documentation side of the house so that people are held accountable for different situations. So we have their different processes that are listed. But then there's also the technology updates. Technologies are constantly changing. That's no different from exoskeletons. A version 1 becomes a version 2 within 6 months or a year. And then you're off to version 3 by 5 years. So those are also things to consider when you're doing your purchasing, when you're doing your different agreements with your different suppliers, because they're important. Again, you're thinking about not just the feasibility of the exoskeleton, but in the long run, the sustainability. How do you sustain this over time? And so with that, I will close for questions. I don't know if we're done with exoskeletons, maybe not. I know a lot of my Boeing folks will give you their opinions, but it is an ever-changing landscape here at the company, not just for exoskeletons, but technologies in general. And it is a fun space, I will say. So thank you for having me, Berkeley. Alan, if you are on there, I'll come back on camera and we can close out the presentation for questions.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that presentation. I do have some great questions coming in. This is a good time to throw your questions up if you have some. Let me start by the first couple that came in. They're sort of related, so I'll give them to you at the same time. Can you compare and contrast the cost and use of robotics versus exoskeletons to reduce operational injury? And then Dr. David Rempel, special guest, he says, given the rapid emergence of functional robots, will there be a need for exoskeletons going forward?
Ooh, this is good competition. I will say having to support both spaces, both automation, robotics, and if you want to call it exoskeletons, wearable robotics, there's a space for all of those. If you think of the hierarchy of controls, obviously at the top of those, the most impactful one is removing the hazard altogether, then going into the substitution phase and then the engineering phase, which is where your robotics and automation may come in. Those do have higher levels of impact because now you're talking about infrastructure change. You're looking at ways that you're investing in people in different ways so that you can move them around to safer spaces, maybe supporting those automation of robots. But then removing the hazard altogether or substituting the hazard through those engineering controls. So I will say those are effective. They are expensive though, and require years and years of investment. Again, speaking back to those human readiness levels that we talked about up front in the robotics, in the automation, so that people can work in them. That then goes down to the exoskeleton level, which is what we consider personal protective equipment. That one, the impact level is much more variable. As I mentioned throughout the presentation, it requires a lot of cultural changes to make sure people use the exoskeletons. It isn't a requirement, it is an option, so people do have a choice in this day and age. So that may help answer some of those questions. Exoskeletons are cheaper, maybe less impactful or consistent over time, whereas the machine side is more expensive investment, but also probably more sustainable over time. Does that make sense? More consistent.
Yes,
And
thank you.
then, Alan, can you help me with Dr. Rempel's question again? It's great hearing him on here.
It really was about the future needs of exoskeletons given the rapid advancement of robots in general.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm seeing emerge is the hybridization between autonomy, artificial intelligence, and wearable technologies. And you can use exoskeletons as the case study in this case. So we've gone from passive exoskeletons as a primary type of exoskeleton that's out there to maybe a smarter passive exoskeleton that is aware of itself and aware of its user, to provide feedback or collect information to the user, to looking at potentially controlling the different actuators on the user. It depends on how the AI and the automation may feed into that. But there is a blend space where you can see that. Now, how is that practical back to the end user is always the question. I jokingly say, if I was an amazing chemist and I had the ability to invent a powerful chewing gum that all you had to do was chew, and if you chewed this, you would never be injured. It's like an invisible force field that protects your body. I'm sure there would be some complaints about the flavor of the chewing gum. And so it comes back to people are people and they're unique individuals, and you can't always assume everybody would take on that technology or that capability the same way as others may.
Sure.
So
Okay.
hopefully that helped a little.
Along those lines, first you did answer a question about, you did refer to it as PPE, and the question was, are they voluntary to use? And you've answered that one already. They are in fact voluntary. And the next question that's related is, what type of usability testing did you do to gain the perceptions of the workers being asked to use these devices?
Yeah, so the different phases that we went through that I had depicted with usability, some of those things looked at just donning and doffing, functional capability. Can you turn it on? Can you turn it off? Can you apply this with your work tools if you're wearing tool belts or if you're working in confined spaces? So it's really looking at the individual and the individual work environment, and then tuning that exoskeleton into that microcosm, and then looking across the multiple microcosms at the macro level and seeing the type of work that these exoskeletons make sense to use them in. So you tended to look at kind of the combination, the usability, the user experience, and then pulling in the biomechanics and ergonomics.
Okay, great. Next one, how effective have exoskeletons been at decreasing worker injuries?
I will say there has been a point in time where we had exoskeletons deployed for over a year in certain parts of the company. We did see injury rates decrease in those areas. It's the consistency part that I mentioned. It's difficult to maintain in our space the exoskeletons over the fluidity of the workforce, because folks may come in, they may go out, and we may not have the necessary subject matter expertise workforce to keep up with the trainings and keep up with the people that are constantly changing in those spaces. So that has been a difficulty from our end.
Okay, so next one is the initial fitting and adjustment period for exoskeletons can be a major hurdle for user adoption. What strategies would you suggest to ensure successful sort of fittings to help users navigate the initial adoption phase, acclimatization phase, rather, to be precise?
Yeah. So when we're choosing our exoskeletons, one of the things we've thought about was simplicity in design. Just how easy is it to put on? Is it like putting on a t-shirt, or is it like putting on, some suspenders for a set of pants? How difficult is it? And that's part of the usability assessment that we use in our screening. We try to do that up front. Just get an initial swag. What does this make sense to the end user? We pull in a couple experts, try out the systems and see if they can don, doff, activate, deactivate, try it on a couple of areas. If that makes sense and those are feasible, then we move more into the more intense investigations, looking at biomechanics and the ergonomics, looking at laboratory studies, making sure they don't hurt people. They don't transfer hazards around the body, things like that. But that initial swag is really the most important, I guess you could say, sniff test, to make sure the exos make sense there.
Okay, maybe you got a short answer for this one, but has the turnover, the large turnover that you mentioned, has it been due to physical injuries or other psychosocial factors, job satisfaction, stress, etc.?
Yeah, so I didn't mention it's the company is over 170,000 people. A large contingent of that is in the United States. A large contingent of that is manufacturing, looking at mechanic workforce. So tens of thousands of people across many different states in the 50 states. So when we're looking at these, you're talking a organically fluid environment where people change and shift across the country, across jobs over time. People are always trying to upgrade themselves to new jobs. It's natural. And so that's what we're looking at. We're also looking at not only the mechanics, the end users, but also the people who are the experts, the ergonomists, the biomechanists, the industrial athletes, the human factors people. These folks are always moving and upgrading themselves as well. Same can be said with our operations leaders, our managers, our executives. They're doing the same. So once you lose a champion, you have to reignite and create another champion. And that consistency over time is a distinct heartache.
Okay, great. So we are at the top of the hour, so technically we are out of time. There are more questions here that I could possibly get through anyway, and a lot of good ones, I will say. Um, I I think we'd better wrap it up. If you have questions for Dr. Reid, people can reach out to you directly to pose some of these questions to you. I even see something about an invitation to present at a conference. This is there's a lot of good stuff here. So please don't leave your question hanging. If you feel it really needs a it's pressing and needs an answer, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Reid. I'm sure he'll take the time to answer your questions and accept your invitation.
For sure. Thanks, Alan.
Of course. As a reminder to everybody, if you logged in today with your registration email, you'll get a link to an evaluation form. That's going to qualify you for a certificate of completion worth 1 CE contact hour. If you have any questions for us here at COEH Northern California, you can always drop us a line at coehce@berkeley.edu. That's coehce@berkeley.edu. I want to say a big thank you to our special guest today. Really appreciate it, Dr. Reid. It was a really rich, informative presentation and a lot of fun. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for having me, and take care, everybody. Hope you enjoyed.
Absolutely. We'll see everybody next time.
Bye all.